Today I'd like to present the story of one philosopher's 12th century journey across the Mediterranean. And this journey shows both how a common philosophical culture could be spread across the Mediterranean, while at the same time acknowledging the radical diversity of the region's philosophical thought. The story that I'm going to tell is contained in a biographical dictionary by Ibn al-Kifti, a 13th century Muslim bureaucrat and scholar who, while writing the dictionary, was head of the treasury for a son of Saladin who ruled in Aleppo. Ibn al-Kifti's biographers portray him as a reluctant holder of political power who would far rather have been left to his books. He did, however, make the most of his fate. In addition to extensively socializing with the most prominent literati of his age, he used his governmental position to become the most important collector of books, perhaps of the known world of the time, and when he died, his collection was reportedly valued at some 50,000 dinars, which is an extraordinarily large sum. Ibn al-Kifti used his political power and access to wealth to reach out and give patronage to some of the great intellectuals of his age. He gave patronage to Yaqut, a scholar who wrote one of the most influential geographical works of the medieval period, and he also reportedly helped Yaqut with its writing. He met and befriended the famous Andalusian mystic Ibn al-Arabi, as well as as-Suhrawardi, the founder of the Islamic Illuminationist school of philosophy. In short, Ibn al-Kifti's friends and acquaintances were a who's who of intellectuals from across the Islamic world, and it was fitting that he chose to memorialize them in a series of 3 biographical dictionaries. One of these contains biographies of literati, another of the ulama, or the Islamic learned classes, but the one from which the entry before you is drawn is his biographical dictionary of the hukama, or philosopher-physicians. The dictionary is particularly interesting because of the view of court life that it provides and the active participation of philosophers in that life. The philosophers which it describes are not cave-bound creatures who shun and are shunned by the world. They are individuals who actively participate in political life, and their jockeying for power and involvement in court intrigue forms the background of their philosophy. The descriptions that Ibn al-Kifti's dictionary provides allow us to build a rich picture of who the philosophers were, why they decided to engage in philosophy, and why their practice of philosophy was tolerated or even encouraged by the societies in which they lived. So let's read the beginning of the entry that I've translated. Abu al-Hajjaj Yusuf ibn Yahya ibn Ishaq as-Sabti al-Maghribi, a resident of Aleppo, who was known in Ceuta as Ibn Shamun, who was his 8th or 9th great-grandfather and a physician of Fezi origin. While his father was occupied there in Ceuta with work in the market, Yusuf studiously read philosophy in these lands and attained a good grasp of it, and also applied himself to mathematics and excelled in it. These sciences were always present in his mind during discussions. Some notes on this passage. Ceuta was a prosperous Mediterranean trading city, which served as a point of economic exchange between Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Despite its smallish size, Ceuta boasted a vibrant intellectual life, which was in active communication with intellectual centers throughout the Islamic world. Yusuf's father's position as a successful merchant in Ceuta allowed him to devote his youth to the study of philosophy and science. By noting Yusuf's roots in the town of Ceuta, Ibn al-Kifti is drawing attention to his recent but very successful transplant to Aleppo. Ibn al-Kifti's audience would also immediately have recognized Yusuf's family name, Ibn Shamun, as Jewish, a detail which soon comes to be of importance. Ibn al-Kifti continues, again in the text you have, when the Jews and Christians of this land were forced to choose between conversion to Islam or exile, he hid his religion. But when he was able to devise a means to leave for the land of Egypt, he did so and emigrated with his property. Here, Ibn al-Kifti describes Yusuf's migration from the Maghreb to Egypt and then to Syria, and briefly alludes to the events which precipitated this, namely the persecutions of the Almohads, the dynasty which forcibly wrested control of the Islamic West from the Almoravids during the first half of the 12th century. The Almohad period was, in many ways, one of the high points of Islamic philosophy and perhaps of the Islamic humanistic sciences in general. After uniting the Maghreb and most of Muslim Spain under their leadership, the Almohads quickly instituted a rich cultural program. By offering generous stipends, they drew scholars from far and wide to their court for the purpose of encyclopedically gathering together all available knowledge of the time across many disciplines. They commissioned great anthologies of Quran and Hadith commentaries, which were intended to reflect the state of the field of their day. Numerous works of pedagogy were written in order to increase literacy in Arabic and in basic Islamic texts. Summas of Islamic law were written. Compendious works of Sufi mysticism were composed. Even Ahmad al-Buni's classic work on Islamic magic was the product of the Almohad cultural program. Outside the field of sacred texts, books were put together to summarize and digest the ancient sciences, including works on botany, astronomy, alchemy, agriculture, medicine, and logic. The production of works on ancient philosophy was highly incentivized by the Almohads, and these were produced on a particularly large scale. The famous philosopher Averroes wrote his magisterial commentaries on almost all the works of Aristotle at the request of the Almohads and with their generous patronage. Another philosopher, Ibn Tufayl, wrote his work Hayy ibn Yaqdhan for Almohad court elites. The work is a philosophical novel about a baby abandoned on an island and raised by a doe who eventually reasons his way to knowledge of God and metaphysics. Philosophy was given pride of place among the humanities. Central to the Almohad legacy was their message that Muslims needed to emphasize the importance of monotheism more than they had hitherto done. The name Almohad, in Arabic al-Muwahhidun, was intended to reflect this principle. It means those who proclaim God's unity. The Almohads felt that most Muslims before them had not taken this Islamic message seriously and had often understood God as possessing corporeal elements, that is to say, as having a body or being in some way human or human-like. This, they believe, compromised God's unity because anything which was understood to be corporeal could be divided into many parts. To remedy this situation, the Almohads invited philosophers who understood God as being quintessentially incorporeal to their court to teach people to understand God correctly. It was for this reason that philosophers were given honor and prestige among the Almohads. By contrast, under the previous Almoravid dynasty, philosophers had been virtual pariahs and other intellectuals had been given only very limited patronage. Turning back to our biographical entry, it is highly likely that Yusuf's enthusiastic devotion to the philosophical sciences was shaped by Almohad enthusiasm in these areas. Indeed, the thought of many Jewish philosophers, most famously Moses Maimonides, bore the indelible print of Almohad influence. Sarah Strumza, in her recent biography of Maimonides, even suggests that Maimonides is best thought of as an Almohad fundamentalist. However, despite the enthusiasm of such Jews with the Almohadic intellectual project, the Almohads' patronage of philosophy was accompanied by an unprecedented intolerance for Christians and for Jews. Before the Almohads, the lives of Jews and Christians had been regulated by a document known as the Pact of Umar. The Pact of Umar protected Jews and Christians from forced conversion and gave them freedom to practice their religion in exchange for accepting a certain set of legal disabilities. Although historians debate the nature of the quality of life which Jews and Christians enjoyed under Islam, there is no doubt that it was the Pact of Umar which ensured the survival of Jewish and Christian communities in the Islamic world for over a millennium. The Almohads put an end to this form of coexistence. They rejected the Pact of Umar and forced Jews and Christians to choose between exile and conversion to Islam. Why did the Almohads endorse this policy, which was without precedent in the Islamic world? Their motive sprang from the same impulse which had benefited the philosophers, their reverence for pure monotheism. Monotheism for the Almohads was Islam's most important teaching. Perhaps, Almohad thinkers said, Jews and Christians in the time of the Quran had been good monotheists, and this had led the Prophet Muhammad to urge that they be tolerated. However, they continued, the Jews and Christians of their own time were not monotheists. In fact, the Almohads argued, their imperfect conceptions of God amounted to polytheism. To allow Jews and Christians to remain in Almohad lands would risk defiling the monotheism of the Muslims. They therefore ruled that, in the name of putting an end to polytheism, Jews and Christians had to go. The very concern with monotheism, which had benefited the philosophers, thus acted to the disadvantage of Jews and Christians. As a result, many Christians and Jews fled, and some, like Yusuf and the famous Maimonides, did so after first having lived nominally as Muslims. Although Islamic law does not generally allow converts to revert to their original religion, it often granted an exception to those who were forced to convert by the Almohads, and neither Yusuf nor Maimonides was persecuted for having reverted back to Judaism. On the contrary, they both found a warm welcome in the administration of Saladin and his heirs. Once in Egypt, Yusuf immediately found a community among fellow philosophically inclined exiles. He met Maimonides, the head of the Jews, in Egypt, and the two edited an Islamic astronomical text together, the astronomy of Jabir ibn Aflah al-Andalusi, which Yusuf had brought with him from Ceuta. Yusuf then left Egypt, eventually settling in Aleppo, and Ibn al-Kifti continues in the text you've got in front of you. He left Cairo for Damascus, alighted in Aleppo, resided there for a time, and became allied through marriage with an Aleppan Jew known as Abul al-Ala, the secretary of the revenue office. He then left Aleppo to trade in Iraq and went so far as India. He returned home safe, became wealthy, and gave up traveling. He began to trade and bought a property close by Aleppo. People went to him for instruction, and he taught many of its residents and travelers. He worked with the elite physicians in the court of Azahiriya in Aleppo and was full of genius and of a penetrating mind. Ibn al-Kifti then remarks, there was a long-lasting friendship between us. Here, the formal biographical aspect of the dictionary ends, and a description of an intimate personal relationship begins. We learn that the two are as comfortable talking philosophy and medicine as they are with helping one another with personal problems. And I'm going to the text again. One day, Ibn al-Kifti writes, Yusuf complained to me saying, I have 2 daughters, and I fear for them lest the Sultan take a share of the inheritance. I wish that I could have a male child. So I told him of a trick to use during coitus in order to obtain a male child that was reported by one of the physicians. He said, "I want to do that." He then married another wife on account of the death of the first, and after some time, she conceived. He said, "I've done what you said," and she, as God had wished, gave birth to a male child. He came to me jubilant with happiness. But then, after some time, I heard that the mother of the child had taken him to the bathhouse and had poured too much hot water over him, and he had died. As a result of this, he became deeply troubled, and when I came to him to console him, I said to him, "Be patient and do it again." So he did, and she conceived and gave him a male child. He called him Abdul-Baki, and he lived. Then he ignored what I told him, and she conceived and gave him a daughter. He blamed himself for ignoring what I had told him, and after some time employed it again, and she bore him another male. So he said, "I cannot deny the truth of what my experience tells me. It has become settled for me such that I cannot deny it." Today, Ibn al-Kifti's relationship with Yusuf might seem to be an unlikely one. Ibn al-Kifti was from an elite Muslim family. Like his father and grandfather before him, he had been trained in sacred law and had risen in the ranks as a judge until he became Ministry of the Treasury. He thus occupied one of the highest governmental ranks, as well as being a respected member of the Islamic religious hierarchy. Yusuf, on the other hand, was a Jewish emigrant from what is now a Spanish enclave in Morocco, who had spent his life as a trader, but had picked up enough religious and medical knowledge on the side to be regarded both as a doctor and as a rabbi. However, despite these differences, their friendship grew and was important enough for Ibn al-Kifti to publicly memorialize in his dictionary. The friendship is all the more amazing because it emerges during a difficult time for interfaith relations. Yusuf had fled the Islamic West as a result of a dynasty that had compelled him to live as a Muslim. Once he arrived in Ayyubid lands, he was, like many other educated Jews who had fled, welcomed into this new socioeconomic world. However, Ayyubid lands could also be a difficult place for interfaith relations. Perhaps scarred by the Crusades, which Saladin had successfully fought back, the Ayyubid regime emphasized the importance of social laws which separated Muslims from people of the book, which had only been laxly enforced under their Fatimid predecessors. While these laws were directed more at Christians than at Jews, the latter were also affected by them. Thus, it is all the more remarkable that a friendship like this one emerged when it did. It soon becomes clear that what draws Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf together is their shared philosophical study. This comes across in a pact which the two made. Ibn al-Kifti writes, again in your text, "One day, I," that's Ibn al-Kifti, "said to him, Yusuf, if the soul is immortal, after death, it will know the state of all that exists outside of it. So make a pact with me, that if you die before me, you will appear to me, and if I die before you, I will appear to you." He agreed, and I urged him not to neglect his promise. He died, and after 2 years had passed, I saw him in my sleep. He was sitting in the courtyard of a mosque outside the funerary compound. He was wearing new white garments of Nasafi fabric. I said to him, "O doctor, did we not agree that you would come to inform me of what you had encountered?" But he laughed and turned his face away. So I grabbed him by the hand and said, "You must tell me what you encountered and what it is like after death." He said to me, "The universal is connected to the universe, and the partial is connected to the part. I understood that he was speaking about his condition. That is, he was indicating that the universal soul returned to the universal world, and the body, which is partial, remains with the part which is the earth's center. After waking, I was amazed at the brilliance of what he had indicated. We ask God to forgive us when we return to the Creator. May his glory be honored and exalted. The idea of this kind of return after death pact is a common one in world literature. Perhaps the most famous in Western literature occurs in Boccaccio's Decameron. The purpose of the pact between Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf was that of determining which religious worldview was true. It would appear that there are three reasonable candidates: Islam, Judaism, and philosophy, although one can still imagine the truth to involve various permutations of these three. Ibn al-Kifti could have easily used the device of the dream in order to get the better of his friend by touting the truth either of Islam or of his own philosophical doctrine. Instead, however, he indicates that the result is ambiguous. The description of Yusuf in the afterlife is not a simple endorsement of Islamic, Jewish, or philosophical truth. Yusuf in the afterlife is in a happy state, and this outcome has vindicated the way that he chose to live his life. He stands outside the mosque by the funeral complex, not inside the mosque. The presence of a mosque is a vindication of Islam, but Yusuf's happy state outside of the mosque seems to indicate that other forms of observance might also grant a path to salvation. Ibn al-Kifti's dream highlights the radical difference between this world and the next. After his death, Yusuf seems reluctant to respond to his friend Ibn al-Kifti at all. He lets a full 2 years pass without contacting him, and when he finally does appear to him, he is at first unwilling to look at, let alone speak to him. He is only prevailed upon to do so after Ibn al-Kifti grabs him by the hand. Even after this, Yusuf's response is cryptic. It is a response which is reminiscent of philosophy, but lacks the definition that one customarily finds in philosophical texts. It is a thought-provoking and imaginatively evocative response, but it belongs more to the hazy world of dreams than to the philosophical texts that Yusuf studied during his lifetime. Ibn al-Kifti indicates a certain amount of uncertainty regarding its meaning, but he seems to think that it supports a certain kind of Neoplatonic philosophy. That part of the soul which has cognized universal truths lives on, while the part of a human being which is merely animal remains on earth to decay. Ibn al-Kifti thus views the dream as supportive of his continuing philosophical studies. However, Yusuf's answer gives no specific guidance about which philosophical path should be taken. The dream seems to indicate that in life, difficult intellectual and religious choices need to be made, and that these choices are made without the intervention of heaven. How is one to assess the implication of Ibn al-Kifti's biography of Yusuf for understanding the relevance of the concept of the Mediterranean to medieval philosophy? On the one hand, the philosophy of the Almohad court, which excludes Jews and Christians, seems to clash with the philosophy cultivated in the court of Ibn al-Kifti in Aleppo, which embraced individuals of all monotheistic religions. These societies had little in common and viewed one another with mutual apprehension and disdain. On the other hand, the philosophical learning in both places was similar enough to facilitate the transition of an individual from one location to another with a great deal of ease. Yusuf found a home in the Islamic East where his philosophical learning was appreciated. He was able to insinuate himself into this new place, forming deep relationships with both Muslims and Jews whom he met there. Quite how deep these relationships went is hinted at in Ibn al-Kifti's dream, which seems to represent the very hope of the idea of the Mediterranean. That is, a philosophical society which is inclusive of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, not only in this world, but even in the next. What made the friendship between Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf possible? It is tempting to turn to the idea of the Mediterranean as the answer. The two philosophers received a common education on its shores, which perhaps helped them to find one another and then deepen their friendship. However, one needs to also consider the possibility that it was Islamic culture and not the Mediterranean which fostered this relationship. While Islamic culture was heavily represented in the Mediterranean, it also extended well beyond it. One wonders whether Yusuf and Ibn al-Kifti, for example, would have found one another had they alighted in Baghdad instead of Aleppo. Evidence of friendships across religious lines in Baghdad force one to admit that it is very possible that they would have. Further, the philosophical influences of Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf are not solely the product of Mediterranean thinkers, but also the product of thinkers who lived in the Islamic world beyond the Mediterranean. We might therefore, with Marshall Hodgson, call Yusuf an Islamicate thinker rather than a Mediterranean thinker. A thinker who, while not a Muslim, was highly influenced by the Islamic cultural sphere of influence. A thinker whose influences and social connections span not just the Mediterranean, but also the Mesopotamian world and beyond. There is a temptation to define the Mediterranean milieu as one bound by the forces of a common humanistic intellectual enlightenment, a common physical environment, and a tolerance born of common mercantile interests. These forces at once bind the countries of the Mediterranean together and separate them from the less diverse inland regions with which they share a common religion. In a sense, the Mediterranean is supposed to loosen the ties that bind the lands of Christendom to each other and the lands of Islam to each other. Instead, it creates different ties that bind, a shared space comprised of mutual shared interests. I think, however, that Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf's story problematizes that idea in a number of ways. First, their story highlights the murky nature of cultural enlightenment and religious coexistence. The very same atmosphere that promotes philosophical and scientific enlightenment in the Almohad Maghreb in Spain also spells doom for interreligious tolerance and the end of Judaism and Christianity in the region. Meanwhile, in Syria, the site of the Crusades and the very epitome of the clash of civilizations, there is still intellectual room there and physical safety for religious coexistence in lands ruled by Muslims. Secondly, it is important to note that there is nothing post-religious or secular about Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf. They are trained in religious laws that govern the daily life of believers, and they care about the ultimate religious questions, as is exhibited in their final conversation. Their respective religions matter to them, and they care who is right and who is wrong. But, interestingly enough, that interest in religious truth and falsehood itself binds them together. Even after death, it binds them. And for Ibn al-Kifti, it seems that his very conviction that there is a truth about God, about revelation, about the mosque, keeps him respectful of Yusuf's own divergent views. Thirdly, Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf's story highlights an important factor that makes them able to move around the Mediterranean. It is financial and medical literacy. These skills in finance and in medicine are easily recognized, useful, and in great demand. Are these Mediterranean skills? Perhaps they are, or perhaps we historians are put in a difficult situation because so many of our Mediterranean sources come from this particular class of people, and we have a tendency to equate this class of people with the Mediterranean more generally. Fourth, it is important for scholars to acknowledge, when studying the medieval Mediterranean, that there are very large gaps between our ideals and the ideals of individuals like Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf, whom we often do portray as the good guys. They bond, after all, over a coitus trick to get fewer female children, a trick that we know isn't biomedically sound, and, if it were, with which most of us would doubtless have significant ethical qualms. So what is the use of studying the Mediterranean, or more specifically, the medieval Mediterranean? The Mediterranean serves as a useful testing ground for many popular theories of conflict and coexistence. A study of its history clearly refutes the clash of civilizations model, but that being said, the Mediterranean possesses some of the bloodiest borders in all of history. Studying the Mediterranean refutes the academic model that cultivation of the humanistic sciences necessarily leads one to be tolerant. And yet it also provides models which provide significant religious tolerance on different terms. Most of all, I feel that my study of the Mediterranean has stressed the importance of carefully evaluating local factors, and perhaps forever abandoning the search for enticing, overarching, explanatory models. This is what the story of Yusuf and Ibn al-Kifti teaches me. One can attempt to explain their friendship in terms of Mediterraneanism, politics, religion, or economics, but these do not determine everything in a relationship. Ultimately, it seems, Ibn al-Kifti and Yusuf bond as fathers, they bond over a bereavement, and they bond over a shared quest for life's meaning. Thank you.